This week in the markets, a review, Q2 of 2024. Started off with HPAI, ended with lessening drought and a slow replenishing of our national cattle herds. And I stress, slow. We're still on the lower side, but these things take time. Here's the report. April 2024, there was still some concerns over the transference of avian influenza to humans via cattle, but it seemed the situation was well in hand. What wasn't was the future of grain prices, considering planting had just begun. Corn, a major topic.
Where corn has been lately from a price standpoint, it's not been as competitive as it has been in past years. Last year we planted a lot of corn at nearly 95 million acres. So with that, we've had a depression in price. We've carried over a lot of stocks from last year, so corn acreage had to come back. It's kind of on the low end, though, of where a lot of industry experts thought it would be. 90 million acres was kind of the lowest estimate that industry thought. So it's not really a bullish market factor yet, but it's right on the edge. So as we get into planting with corn, it's going to be very important. If any weather delays, we could probably see a pretty nice price rally in the corn market as we go through plantings.
On the livestock side, the cattle on feed report showed an interesting development. Seems that feedlot placements were slow, odd considering the high price cattle was reaching at the time, and still is right now.
Placements over the last 6 months period have been down about 2%. So there's been fewer cattle going into feedlots over the past half year, but a lot of them are staying longer. They're getting heavier, and so we've seen dress weights go up quite a bit, and we've seen cattle just hanging around a little bit longer. How long that lasts is going to be interesting. It's almost like you're kind of building this inventory a little bit, but eventually, those cattle have to roll, and so it's really interesting where the feedlot dynamics are right now.
May saw the near completion of planting, and the discussion turned towards weather. In Mississippi, some heavy rains in part of the state caused late planting and some flooded fields. Nationally, good rains during spring showed that the ongoing drought seemed to be on its way out.
So, we are seeing the rains come through. That drought situation is getting alleviated as we go forward, and overall the expectation is for it to improve as we get into the time of year when the crop really needs the rain. With how fast we're getting the crop planted, I imagine we put more in the ground than USDA's kind of said. We saw this last year when we had really good planting conditions. We planted about 3 million more acres than the USDA said we would in March. When the farmers can plant corn, they like to plant corn. So I imagine that number's going to jump based off how well planting's been going.
There's very few areas in the U.S. right now that are under any sort of drought categorization. So we're entering, 2024 so far in a much better spot. Hopefully we're going to have more available pasture, and we've also talked about having fewer cattle in general. So that's different for this year, at least for right now, that we're not continuing to talk about drought conditions. One thing to keep an eye on, beef packer margins are pretty tight and even negative in a lot of cases. So that is putting a little bit of pressure on where fed cattle prices can go. The box beef cutout it's at high levels, but it's probably not as high as a lot of people expected it to be, and so that's putting some strain on that particular sector, and putting a bit of a lid on where fed cattle prices can go, and of course that filters back down into feeder cattle prices as well.
Heading into June, the market story shifted towards what growing and harvest season had in store. The June WASDE report didn't really shake up the markets much, but it did give us an idea of what our stock situation looked like.
The trade did expect to see maybe a bump in exports in the old crop because we've had some stronger corn exports recently, so that was a little bit surprised that they didn't adjust the export numbers on corn. But overall, not much new on the corn market. Soybeans side, we saw them adjust domestic crush for the old crop down 10 million bushels or so. So that drove up our ending stocks, just that lower demand coming into the new crop. But so a little bit bearish on soybeans. But outside of that, no huge changes from what we saw last month.
On the cattle side, however, some big news in placements, up 4% compared to 2023. Looks like the cattle rebound had begun.
So this was a big surprise, although it didn't really have a negative impact on prices that you might typically expect whenever you see larger placements. So overall, big headline, surprising reaction is placements were a lot higher than were expected last month. Even though we saw larger totals in May than we did in 2023, for the year so far in 2024, we're still running about 2.5% below.
A significant quarter this year. It saw the beginning and ending of planting, the start of growing season, and some important cattle progress.